Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Koepp, co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring one of the most urgent issues of this year and many years to come, which is about diversity hiring, innovative ways for companies to meet their goals. With rising expectations for corporate workforces to reflect the diversity of America, what are the best practices for succeeding? Why did companies fall short in the past, and what have we learned about that? Today, we'll be exploring new ideas, tools, and methodologies for building diverse and inclusive workforces in 2021 and beyond. Before we dive into this topic, we'd like to thank our partner, Appcast. I'll tell you a little bit about them. Appcast transforms recruitment marketing by optimizing online job posting programs and helping leading organizations find and hire talent. Since 2014, Appcast has powered 610 million job postings, generated 7.4 billion clicks, 1.2 billion applications, and have managed 600 million in ad spending. Now, a few quick logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And look out for a written account of this conversation soon on our website at fromday1.co. At around 3 p.m. Eastern Time, at the top of the hour, we will have a Q&A session. You can submit your questions starting now using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And at that time, Lydia, our moderator, will be fielding the questions. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, the business journalist Lydia Dishman, who reports and edits for Fast Company on tech and leadership issues, and has written for CBS Money Watch, for Fortune, and for the New York Times, among others. Okay, Lydia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you everyone for spending some time with us this afternoon. I have no doubt that our panelists are going to offer some amazing insights and some practical how-tos that you can take away and perhaps try with your own teams. As Steve said, I am a business reporter. I've been focusing on workplace issues now for about the last 7 to 10 years, which is probably 105 in dog years, if you think about what the media is like. And I've always been fascinated by my reporting on diversity. And I was very interested to see that McKinsey released a report in mid-May, making the business case for diversity stronger than ever. Their data suggested that 1/3 of the companies they studied had made significant inclusion and diversity gains over the past 5 years. And they are pulling ahead of their industry peers in financial performance. So we know that there is a connection between having a more diverse workforce, having more diverse leadership, and the bottom line. But it's important to note that most of this research was carried out during the past 5 years where companies were benefiting from more favorable economic conditions. That said, we know from past crises that diversity can also play an important role in recovery, which we're all, I hope, starting to think about now. For example, reports during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis indicated that banks with female board members were more stable and those run by women were less vulnerable during the crisis. And female leadership across the globe seems to be more successful at handling the COVID-19 pandemic. But for some organizations, DEI was deprioritized during the height of the pandemic. And this can have, as we know, serious consequences on representation going forward. Think about all those video calls that we're on now and how perhaps an LGBTQ employee may not feel comfortable turning on their camera while working from home if they're not out to their colleagues. Or those in other underrepresented groups who don't have equal access to broadband or even a dedicated home workspace. But the good news is that according to Glassdoor, DEI positions are on the rise again. And if anything has come out of the tragedy of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, it's that organizations have pledged to increase diversity and belonging. So, as I said, today our panelists are going to share insights on how to put pledges into practice. So, without further ado, that was a lot of talking from me. I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves and tell us very briefly about your work and where you are in your DEI journey. Chad, why don't we start with you? You're nodding very, very vigorously.
Okay, thank you. My name, it's great to be with you all. Lydia, great to reconnect. Chad Hiu serve as one of the senior directors of diversity and inclusion with YMCA of the USA here in Chicago, Illinois. I'm standing in for my colleague, Michael Farris, who was going to be with you all and is much cooler than I. I am an openly gay Asian American man, born in Honolulu, Hawaii, married to an immigrant, struggling with mental health challenges, and trying to find my way in this challenging time. I've been with the YMCA for almost 20 years professionally, and at our organization, we are federated, which means it's super fun to support diversity, equity, inclusion work when we have no authority, but all the responsibility. There are over 800 independently incorporated YMCAs that are 501c3s across the nation, all of which are struggling right now as we open and close and open and close and try to provide safe spaces for childcare, food access, housing security, and fitness and wellness. And it is an amazing, amazing time to do this work. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. Great context. Thank you for that. Brittany, why don't we go to you next?
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany King-Offord, and I'm here representing AT&T as their lead talent acquisition, talent marketing manager for our underserved communities. My role actually came about when we saw a need to really get into the, to try to be more be a bit more intentional about how we approach hiring in markets that we typically don't really service that well. For instance, we started a lot of our hiring in the underserved community in Chicago and the inner city, and then also expanding that out to looking at second chance reentry hiring and so forth. I've been with AT&T 8 years, and I also serve as a national board officer for Ability ERG with AT&T, which services our disability space. So I'm super excited to have this conversation, and it is much overdue. So ready to get fired up and ready to go.
Thank you. Yvonne, why don't we go to you next?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yvonne Soto, the Executive Director of Organizational Development and Effectiveness at the New York City Department of Education. I've been with the DOE for 9 years. Prior to that, I come from Philadelphia, where I worked in the School District of Philadelphia and an array of nonprofit organizations and education management organizations serving underserved communities. I'm a public school student, Puerto Rican. I bring that into the work that I do every day. We oversee employee resource groups within the organization, and my work is learning and development, training and support, coaching, and an array of developmental opportunities, all for our 7,000 central administrative employees in New York City, which is the largest school district in the country and the largest single site employer within the country. And I was going to say that we are one of the only school districts, large urban school districts in the country that has been open for in-person learning. But as of today, we had to close our schools temporarily until we can figure out the next phase of opening safely again.
Yeah, I know that coming from New York City myself, parents were eagerly watching that number tick up, and when it hit 3% for the rolling average, and out it went. So just keep on keeping on. Monique, how about you? We go from the largest single site employer to the largest employer. Is that right?
It's correct and accurate. Thank you for that recognition. Hi, everyone. I'm Monique Carswell with Walmart. I'm actually on the Walmart.org team. So that is our combined corporate philanthropy with our foundation. I specifically oversee our associate and customer-facing engagement. So how do we mobilize and activate and encourage them to participate in all things that are social good? And I'm also a leader within our Black and African American resource group. In terms of where we are on our racial equity journey and diversity practices, I would say, hopefully you've seen we did make a commitment in terms of racial equity, which was $100 million over the next 5 years. And we are opening a center, which has actually just had its senior director named. And so we are actively making progress towards those goals, and you'll be seeing a lot more coming out of that.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Leah, the trend and data maven from Appcast.
My new title. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Daniels, and I am the SVP of Strategy for Appcast. And in my role here at Appcast, part of what I do is look at data trends and understand how to help companies make small but very big changes in their process to accomplish various goals, one of which that has obviously come about this year as a bigger goal than we've seen in the past are D&I efforts in their recruiting and attraction efforts. So a big part of my job is to look at what trends are happening and what things companies can change and do. So hopefully we'll be able to bring some of those data points into our conversation today.
Thank you. Yes. And my first question is about trends. We know that everything is changing so rapidly. And if I hear the word unprecedented one more time, ouch. But in your own experience, and this is a question for all of you, throughout the course of the pandemic to now, and certainly since the widespread protests against racial injustice, what have you learned about what aspects of inclusion and belonging have become more important and which are less of a priority, especially when it comes to recruiting and hiring, but also with retention? Who wants to take that one first? I'll take a hand raise here. Otherwise, I'll have to call on you like a teacher. Monique.
Lydia, I'll go ahead and start. So from my perspective and where I sit, giving my attribution, I would definitely say looking at how we can attract is definitely something that we want to ensure we're setting up our current associates to be able to do. So how can they serve as ambassadors? And we obviously know that's tied to employee satisfaction. And when it comes to some of the programs that are important to them, I think racial equity definitely falls under the CSR umbrella. So, but not just in philanthropy, how do we enact that throughout our businesses as well? So how do we ensure that our business practices also are reflective of ensuring that we have social justice and all these things across the board? So from where I sit, we've been able to really make rapid changes when it comes to who we're giving to, the methodology in which we do so, and applying, that racial equity lens, and ensuring that we're doing a lot more listening and being a lot more thoughtful and making sure that we're having those right conversations and the right cadence, and potentially, moving some of the hurdles out of the way. So don't make that access so hard. So ensuring that, we can move quickly, as we know, COVID is rapidly diminishing, populations across the country, and those who are most disproportionately impacted happen to be from, the minority communities. So ensuring that we're doing all that we can quickly and ensuring that those barriers are no longer in place.
So communication and agility. Brittany, do you want to tack on some thoughts?
Absolutely. And to Monique's point, it is really, really critical at this time to take a look at really when we sit back and we unpack who we are at work and being our genuine selves, making sure that that communication is coming across clear across the board. For instance, when I took on my position with AT&T to be an ambassador for hiring for the underserved community, I look back at my journey from when I was in college, when I was coming up in high school, and I was one of those underserved in one of those communities. And I sat back and I looked at what is the representation that I'm seeing, and do I want to be the change that I want to see? So a lot of the culture and a lot of the conversation that's taking place within AT&T is, do we believe in the conversations that we're having in order to invoke change? And how do we sit back and make those connections to connect those cultural stories together? So AT&T this summer, after a lot of the social unrest and just emotional exhaustion from a lot of the employees here, we began to get together and really have candid conversations about what are our pillars, what do we want people to buy in internally as a corporation, and then how can we sit back and create the branding around it so where we can engage potential candidates to want to believe that AT&T is not just talking the talk, but we're also walking the walk. So with that being said, we actually enhanced one of our programs called AT&T Believes, where we are going back into the communities and really serving, not just with just doing basic community service in partnership with CSR, but we're also looking at how do we sit back and engage with upskilling opportunities and also other education opportunities to engage potential candidates to create a pipeline that makes sense so they can reap the benefits of the conversations that we're having internally.
Yeah, the conversations are a great starting point, but it's what you do after that that is putting it into practice. Leah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, one of the things that I preach a lot and what we're starting to see organizations really get good about is measuring what they're doing so that as they make these changes, that we are seeing those impacts. So everything from, are we reaching the audiences that we're looking to reach, and through which channels, right? It's not just a big, are we talking to these right people, right? One of the big questions is, how are we talking to them? Is our referral program working, right? Classically, referral programs are very good for white men, and they're not so good for everyone else. So is our referral program creating more of a problem than it's helping? And should we get rid of it? No, you shouldn't. But how do you change it and then measure the outcome, right? So it's really about measurement. Are you able to measure every step of that candidate journey and every opportunity where you might engage with potential candidates and then get them to say yes, and then keep them, right? So, another very important question is, what does your interview team look like, for example, right? An interview team that is a bunch of white men is more likely to not say yes to women or people of color or anyone underrepresented. Or the other way around, those people are also more likely to say no to you, right? Are you actually losing great candidates, not because you didn't want them, but because they didn't want you? And that could have been unintentional, of course, but it's happening. And so making sure that we're getting really granular in our measurement so we can understand where our opportunities for improvement really lie. I think that's a big part of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into the notion of measuring belonging, but I want to go to Yvonne next because she looks like she wants to add something as well.
Yes, thank you. Leah, I was going to say, and one thing that we're moving away from is not just measuring, not just having these metrics or goals, targets that we're trying to meet that are more clinical, but really getting into like, how are folks feeling? Can they bring their whole selves to work? What does it mean to carry your identities to the workplace and being embraced? How are we creating safe or unsafe spaces? We don't like to say safe spaces, or brave spaces where we can engage in unpracticed conversations as leaders and managers with our peers and colleagues around who they are and what they're feeling and what is their health and mental wellness right now at this time. We've kind of moved away from thinking about, I wouldn't say moved away. One of the points that I want to make is not grandstanding or having platitudes around pledges, but how can we ensure that that's embedded into the fabric of what we do through our priorities and core values, and really centering the voices of people of color within our organization to inform our decisions as we move forward. So as we think about returning to work and what that looks like and creating return to work guidance and resources, how can we lead with inclusivity and empathy? How can we acknowledge that there has been disproportionality to our Black colleagues and Asian colleagues across the system, ensuring that they play a role in reviewing our resources around structured interviewing, diversity recruitment toolkits, et cetera, to ensure that we are kind of going beyond just the mission and vision, but also ensuring that employee voice is centered in the conversation.
I agree with you that there's a difference between measurement and goals, right? I think the goals, you're absolutely right. The I before D, you have to create an inclusive place first. But my argument right now is that you can't know that you're improving if you haven't baselined yourself somewhere, and that identify those places that may actually be doing more harm than good.
Chad, I know that the Y has had its own challenges this year. So why don't you talk a little bit about what's a priority right now?
Thank you. And I know I sometimes ramble on, so feel free to jump in if I'm speaking too long. At the Y, we have, thanks to Kevin Washington, our CEO, and our national board, committed to becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization at the national level. Now, that's us in Chicago. Every Y, every one of those 800 independently incorporated Ys is at a different place along their journey. Just before this, I was with a state alliance that is one of the most diverse states in our country. And some of those Ys don't want the words anti-racism because they feel that that means that their company or their Y or their community is inherently racist. So where do we start? We start with defining terms, making sure we all are singing off the same song sheet. And to Leah and Yvonne's point, I would also say measurement is key, right? And it needs to fit within a broader strategy. One of the biggest challenges that our Ys have, and I think it might be common across all of our sectors and companies, is trying to target diversity metrics without talking about why we're doing that. without looking at tying that into in our case, the communities that we serve, or the change we're trying to make, or the environments we're trying to create. And individual and organizational, we sometimes as leaders in this area or trying to be leaders in this area, jump to the organizational change before we do the individual work. What is our own bias? What is our own learning? Where are our own blind spots? How does that show up in the policies we propose, or the leadership that we embody or try to embody, in the spaces we aim to create? The last thing I'll say is, so for myself, I'm not used to being an ally. As a gay Asian male, I'm used to being one of the oppressed. This is not a time about my dimensions. This is a time about those that identify as Black or African American. So sometimes I need to, if you'll forgive my bluntness, show up and shut up, which is why Michael was going to be here, but he had a family emergency, so he couldn't. So I'm trying my best to channel what he would want me to say. Hope that's helpful.
No, you're nothing if not authentic, and we very much appreciate that. But I do think that, the allyship piece I do want to address as well. Monique, you wanted to add a thought?
Yeah, jumping in on that, similar to all the points that have been made about measurement and goals, I would definitely say from a associate advocate standpoint, it's also a layer of transparency that's needed. So when you make these announcements and commitments, you have to continue to let people know where you are on that journey. So here's where we are, here's how we're getting there, but having a lot more transparency, both internally and publicly. So a lot of folks make commitments and we're not necessarily sure where they stand. So Walmart specifically, we've moved from an annual diversity report to a mid-year. So how can we continue to make improvements and let people know where we are at the same time? So that constant communication and feedback flow.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about that a little bit more, because I know that so many organizations rushed forward, especially, in June, making these pledges to be more inclusive, and, initiatives like you all discussed, to fund Black-owned businesses, for example. So what do you see is the impact of that, both in your organization, and if you want to talk about a broader perspective as well? I'm just curious, do you think that that really has an impact on potential candidates? Brittany, did you want to start with that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with that one. For one, it allowed us to look at really not necessarily diversification in our group, but look at not just looking at diversity from a skin or race perspective, but actually looking for diversity in skill set, looking at diversity from background set. A lot of our struggle had been, and we had been trying to tap into really that reentry space and having real conversations around people that had been formerly incarcerated and looking at them to give them opportunities and chances with employment here. And then better understanding our background check processes, and just those different things, those little nuances that keep those particular individuals from gaining gainful employment, and having real genuine conversations with other corporations such as JP Morgan Chase Bank and many, many others that we're all running into the same issue, because there are people we want to sit back and help, but what are the things that are already in place that are keeping us from really getting down into the nitty gritty and being about the talk that we're talking about? And if anything, if I didn't see anything else this summer from the conversations, it was really a call for accountability. And I think that that's something that we're all saying across the board here is, how am I accountable for what I'm saying, and how am I making sure that it's a forethought, not an afterthought, when we're going through the progressions of making sure that we have our checkpoints and understanding that the data needs to be fresh and we need to be transparent. And in transparency, not just making sure that we put the information out there, but making sure that we are crystal clear and saying it in English. This is what we're doing, and this is how we're accomplishing these things, instead of hiding behind flowery language and the fact that we feel good and great about what we're doing, but making sure that we make it crystal clear and make it plain that we are out here to serve, and we have the components here ready to engage and ready to serve. Another area that we're also seeing that in within our particular business is, how do we strengthen our community partnerships with people like the YMCA or Urban Leagues of America, and various, and really utilizing those partners to build robust, pure pipelines in order to make sure that we are serving these spaces. I think that, we feel good and great when we're partnering with it, and we can sit back and say that we're partnering with these people, but to put the action in place is a whole different beast. So just a couple of things that I see gathered from that particular piece of the conversation.
Yeah, and I have to believe that, candidates can see through a pledge that's just kind of puffy and doesn't have any substance, and one that, you know, the company is really standing behind and shows those ways. Does anyone else have anything to add about that? Do you think candidates care? Do you see a change happening, Chad?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, so, and Brittany said it perfectly, and Lydia, I think oftentimes pledges and statements are the focal point, but not actually what matters, not actually, it's what candidates see performatively, but not what they're looking for in choosing a place to work, right? Or choosing a place to stay. It's the systems change. It's, so an example, everyone was looking for 3 words in somebody's statement, at least at the Y. Did you have Black Lives Matter? And if you didn't, you got nailed. Very rarely did we see initially the words address systemic racism, foster anti-oppressive tactics, ensure that all people feel safe and welcome. The tactics to the performative aspect of this work sometimes gets glossed over. And Michael Farris always says, how do we make this a movement, not a moment? Right? And that's a part of what I think we all are trying to talk about in diversity. There's a movement here that if we don't lose, can change the makeup of every one of our sectors, every one of our companies, every one of our neighborhoods, if we hold on to it and systematize it while people are still paying attention. Unfortunately, that won't be forever. So I think there's a need to ask the candidates that we keep what has made you stay instead of assuming for them. There's a need to make sure that our employee resource groups, our business resource groups are tapped into deciding how we talk about them. Right? At the Y, we're trying to actually have our LGBTQ resource network put a lens on the wording we use. Same thing with Hispanic and Latino, same thing with African American. We've never done that before. It took for them to say, hey, you can't lower, Black cannot be lowercase. You might want to pay attention to that. Then we started to. So just, sorry, Brittany, you got me fired up.
No, getting fired up is a good thing. Go ahead, Monique.
It's a great thing. No, I love what you said, Chad, about it's a movement, not a moment. So as much as, you know, in terms of our current associates and even the pipeline of folks who are looking to work for us, like there's this sense of urgency. So you want to act swiftly, you want to come out big, you want to come out strong, but at the same time, you have to have this steady momentum. So do you have the actual tools in place internally to make sure that you're, like Chad said, equipping your staff to be anti-racist, to understand like, what does that actually mean? How do we unpack that? How do we go forward when we're actually recruiting and reviewing candidates and resumes and things of that nature to make sure we're all on the same page, which is a huge hurdle depending on the size of your organization and where everybody is coming from and where that at on that journey. So you do have to have a little bit of grace around that and continue to, again, question yourselves and your actions and review. So are you having reviewing of your documentation, looking at capitalizing Black, making sure that the way you are speaking is even appropriate in how you're doing your outreach?
Just being in the media, I can tell you that the copy editors were doing a lot of hand wringing when it was time to switch to capitalizing the word Black, which, you know, should have been done ages ago, but that's just my opinion. But yeah, now that we've switched over, it feels right. And I'm glad that it's a thing that we do now. Brittany, you wanted to add?
And just to piggyback on what Monique was also saying here is, you know, 6 months ago, it was the hot conversation to have because everyone was having it. It was everywhere. We couldn't reprint. We couldn't go on the web. We couldn't watch a movie without seeing the Black Lives Matter movement conversation taking place. But now that we are further removed from it, what are we doing now? What type of programming is still in place, and what type of conversations are we still having right now internally that still drives that movement, that's driving that conversation towards diversity and inclusion, that's driving that conversation. And I know that we don't necessarily like this term, but what's driving that conversation to create safe, vulnerable places to where we can unpack and really genuinely be our unique selves. And I think that, you know, as we sit back and look at the last 6 months and everything that's happened within the pandemic, I think it's a great time and opportunity for a lot of us to look at our colleagues and our various partnerships and better understand, okay, we were really hot and heavy with this conversation early on, but what are we doing as the follow-up conversation in order to make sure that we're still engaging in this cause? Because it's not just a movement. This is not just a moment. This is a movement. This is a lifestyle for much of your workforce. So we have to sit back and address it. And it goes so much deeper than just that Black Lives Matter moniker that everybody is attached to. This goes into the disability space. This goes into the Hispanic space. goes into every silo that we have that needs to be broken down so we can all consider each other as a peer without a title. And I think that's one area that we all want to get to eventually. But right now, it's just that overall shock of the exposure that, yes, we still have these silos in place.
I want to pause briefly for a second. I'm sorry, Monique. We're at the half-hour mark, and we do our station identification at this time. So I'm going to invite Steve to come back on.
Thanks, Lydia. Hi, everyone. I'd like to remind anyone joining this excellent conversation in midstream that we're from day one. And today's webinar is exploring diversity hiring, innovative ways for companies to meet their goals. Our sponsor is Appcast. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the top of the hour. Now back to you, Lydia.
Actually, back to Monique. Sorry, I had to cut you off there, but please feel free to jump in.
Sorry,
No worries.
Monique.
If I can remember my thought, that's quite the plug. Trust me, I understand that. So I think it was along the lines of what Brittany was alluding to about, like, what are we putting in place now that will be sustainable? So I think we have to ensure that the things that we are standing up will have that lasting impact. And speaking of plugs, like Walmart just today literally announced a $5 million commitment to North Carolina A&T, which is the largest HBCU, ensuring, and this came from our people team, that commitment. So ensuring that pipeline, ensuring the strength and sustainability of making sure that we have a pool of diverse candidates who are not only being prepared for the workforce for potentially roles at Walmart, but everywhere, at the YMCA, at Appcast, AT&T, wherever that may be.
Yvonne, you wanted to add something, and then Leah will come to you.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to add that as part of the work that we do at the New York City Department of Education, in 2018, we announced that we would do anti-bias training for all 150,000 employees within 4 years. And we've been pushing ourselves to go as fast as possible. But we went beyond just a one-day, one-time training. It was really important for us to do multi-layered. So we have the foundational workshops to have a common language and knowledge around our own internal biases and creating culturally responsive education and environments, capacity building for leaders and teams to be able to do this work within their offices and to continue moving it forward, as well as sustainability efforts. How does this embed into our policies and our practices moving forward? We've trained about over 60,000 employees to date, and we were ready to go with a number of resources when we began to unpack, the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. So we were able to create resource guides to discuss Black Lives Matter protests for leaders and managers, a race and equity page, which was over like 50 pages and sections that talked about interrogating systemic racism, culturally responsive education, social emotional wellness opportunities and resources, and continue to build and leverage technology, our info hub and virtual spaces to continue the conversation beyond just the moment, but this is a movement that's ongoing. And just as far as like some other pledges that we've made, in 2015, it was important to us to have men of color be teachers in our workforce. That's a challenge for school districts across the country. And we pledged to have 1,000 men of color become teachers within 5 years. And we met that metric within 3 years. And we are now moving forward with ensuring that we're moving the percentage of our men of color in the workforce. It's moved from 8% to 13%, and our next goal is 20%. And we are happy to share that this year through all of our various efforts, the teaching force, all of our new teachers for this year, for the first time, are over 50% persons of color or self-identified as persons of color. And that's a big step forward for the DOE.
Well, you need to represent the communities that you're in, and that totally lines up with the New York City school system. Leah, last but not least on this thought.
Just reacting a little bit to Chad's comment about a moment and a movement. One of the great things that we saw over the summer following the protests with George Floyd was a 43% increase in companies hiring for D&I positions. So very excited about that. I do worry that those positions are, I think Chad also said this, all the responsibility and none of the power, but it's a definite first step. What I was really excited to see, though, is that there was a 128% increase in people applying for those jobs. So it's not just companies acknowledging it, it's employees and people who are raising their hand and saying, I want to be part of this and I want to push this movement forward. So I'm excited that the data is supporting this forward progression that we're seeing this year.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, something that Chad noted, DEI practitioners are often a department of one and it's housed within HR. Has your organization added more resources to help with that work, especially when it comes to ensuring that hiring practices are equitable? Chad, you're nodding. I hope to hear good news from you.
And I also want to follow up on what Leah said too, and maybe tie the two together. So when companies do hire DEI officers, and many, including nonprofits, are doing that now, it's important not to do that over and separate from work that's already happening, right? Sometimes there are staff that are already engaged in this work in other departments, and when someone is brought in over, their position, their scope of responsibility isn't connected to work that's on the ground. And then the staff that were doing this work, they head for the hills because they don't feel affirmed. That's happened in multiple companies and including in the Y. Now, in terms of resources allocated, of course, it's the hip cool thing now to have a chief, what's the CDEIO, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. However, who does that person report to, right? If it's just, and I don't mean that diminutively, but if it's just HR, it's just about the people we employ. What about the people we serve? Or the people we're trying to sell a product to, or the people we're trying to engage in philanthropic resources? So how do we tie that across the board? And forgive me, if the only person of color, the only marginalized representation is in the CHRO and or the CDEIO, if I got the letters right, we have a challenge. Lastly, metrics. Sometimes that's only the responsibility of the CDIO, right? They have a magic wand to fix all things inclusion and equity. How are metrics and responsibility and authority tied into everybody's performance plan? CEO on down, board on down, and not from a context of quantitativeness, but qualitativeness. Not just counting heads, not just making sure our metrics are met, but how do people feel safe and included? And as multiple of my colleagues said, being able to bring their full, authentic, beautiful, diverse selves to the table, recognizing that we're all diverse.
Yeah, I think that is such a challenge. And a lot of the leads of ERGs are also basically just volunteers. They're doing it on their own time out of the love for it. And until you connect those roles to the P&L sheet, essentially, it's a very, very challenging position to be in. But it's so important when it does come to hiring, because that role tends to be a driver of those more equitable practices. Does anyone else have any other insights about how that would work at your organization? Not a huge. We can go on to the next one. So in terms of recruiting, again, what practices have been adapted to leverage a hybrid workforce? Is the ability to work remotely, this is a burning question on my mind, a way to widen the pipeline of talent as you see it? Leah, I want to get the data first, and then we can go to the different organizations.
So from a remote perspective, and Lydia, I'm sorry, you broke up on me, so I think I know the question you asked. For a remote perspective, it's interesting to me. Companies have not all gone all in on remote. It's interesting. If you watch what the press releases say, they say things like indefinitely, not permanently, right? And there are some that have committed to a permanent situation. Indefinitely to me is code for remote-ish, like remote for now, but you're going to need to come to the office at some point in time, probably next summer, maybe, I'm not sure. And I think that is sort of hiding, right, what we're trying to accomplish here, because it means you're still operating within the same geographic location that you were at, which means you're still dealing with the same candidate population. So that means you haven't actually changed the dynamics at all of what you're looking to accomplish. And so the next question, of course, is what can you do differently? What should you do differently? And there's some simple things. I think, Lydia, we talked about this before. One of the things that shocks me is that companies invest a ton of effort building beautiful corporate career sites that show their employees and have videos and testimonials, and candidates never visit that site. And so there's this incredible lost opportunity where we don't talk about our DE&I efforts on our job requisitions at all. We put our EEOC requirement in there, we check that box and we move on. In fact, I went back to the data, 1.8% of jobs mention a DE&I or D&I initiative in an organization in the job description, but nearly 55% of candidates never visit your career site. So it's just a lost opportunity. So what can we do different? How do we start talking to our opportunities out in the market? We need to change where we're talking to them so that it's in front of them in their process and not in ours. And then I think the second thing is, if the practices you've been using aren't working to get you to the outcomes you're looking for, you've got to change your practices. So, if you are competing with everyone else in the same pool, maybe you need to find another pool, right? And try to reach out to find the people you're looking for in different ways.
I just had to believe that this, remote-ish, hybrid-ish workforce would offer non-traditional candidates an easier way in, because you didn't have to be in a particular location, at least for part of the time. So that's really the burning question on my mind is, do you think that even a hybrid workforce is going to widen the talent pool? So other takers on this question, Chad?
After you, Monique, I saw you unmute.
I was gonna say, I am filling in for one of my HR colleagues, but as I just made an observation as a general employee or associate, what I've been finding remarkable is that our HR teams are empowering and encouraging all of us to go out and be able to have these conversations with candidates who wouldn't otherwise be in the pool. So providing us with talking points, with toolkits as we're going to various conferences, encouraging us to have sidebars and ask people if they want to, meet with us on the side. So making sure that we're kind of democratizing and not necessarily just putting all that responsibility squarely upon HR, but knowing that it takes, a whole village or a whole army of folks to do that. So I think within the nature of being remote, that has given more access for us to be able to have those one-on-one conversations with folks who may not otherwise have been thinking about positions in our companies.
And if I could follow up on what Monique said, I think at the Y, of course, not every position can be remote. And I do think that one thing that we all should also consider is that remote opportunities are oftentimes available only to certain with privilege. Myself as an example, I am extremely aware that having this job to sit in front of a Zoom, which I complain about sometimes, sorry, is a privilege. I don't know the stats, and maybe Leah, you and others do, but largely, minorities, people that have marginalized populations do not have the same access oftentimes to remote opportunities. And I've been hit with this sometimes, how we show up on Zoom culturally or even dress-wise. Like I threw on a sports coat because last time I had just a t-shirt for a thing, I got like 4 people telling me how unprofessional I was because of my earring, because it shows more now than if I was standing in front of a room, right? So we have to be aware of the bias that may be present in remote-ish, in our policies, in what positions get to work remotely, and the compensation or not that we give people, internet, phone. And somebody mentioned it earlier, not everyone has a safe environment, right? I'm half hoping that my husband doesn't walk behind me, because that might not be good. If you are children, there's been some funny examples of that. It's not equitable across all of our companies. And it's also something that is not comfortable for everyone based on our dimensions of diversity. Just my 2 cents.
Yvonne, I have to think that the opportunity for hiring teachers is changing as well. If there is the opportunity to teach virtually, do you see that as being an equalizer too, especially since you've made such great strides, especially with Black men?
Yes, the pandemic has certainly shifted our timeline and our scale of opportunity to respond to our commitments around hiring. We've moved our events and our job fairs are fully remote, and that has widened the candidate pool across the country, even internationally, for teachers that are considering coming to work for the New York City. And certainly there's opportunities now to work fully remote. And then we are also thinking about ways to continue to expand those efforts ongoing. I'm thinking about, we have fellows that fellowship programs that are normally on site and working with those partners to curate candidate pools across the country and having them support us in very COVID specific tasks that support our organization remotely. I think the challenge what we have is that we are a civil service organization. We are a city agency. We had 0 work from home policy. It was something that was just not acceptable in our culture. And we went to 100% remote for those, as Chad said, whose roles have the privilege of being home. And there's certainly essential functions that may be disproportionately for people of color that have been working in buildings day to day. So we're reflecting on that and thinking about how can we leverage the benefits of remote. We've heard colleagues say that they're more efficient, they're more productive. Certainly individual contributors have had the opportunity to pivot and show their expertise or take on additional responsibilities and almost be able to shine in a way that maybe they wouldn't have the opportunity. There's like an equalizer with Zoom so that you have access and opportunity to communicate with different people at different levels. And so we're thinking about how can we leverage those practices of what we've learned as we come back, and then hopefully still continue to institute some version of a remote work policy.
Brittany, did you want to add something to that?
Absolutely. I heard a mention of going virtual with job fairs and a lot of the events that we've had. And we know that with the current state of where we are with the pandemic, we know that doing our regular showings, our talent marketing piece of what we do we realize now that it's obsolete and that we need to evolve how we think about what we do and actually bringing our materials to where people are. One thing that we've done within AT&T, in my role in particular, is we've had a lot of great engagement with our CSR team as well as our external partners that we work with in this space in order to see, okay, how can we meet you exactly where you are? And how can we leverage our relationship and our materials to ensure that we're building quality pipelines? A lot of that has actually involved our social media and looking at how do we get to candidates, especially in younger demographics that have their phones and their iPads on them at all times. How do we get to those demographics and tell them about the great stuff that we're doing? How do we showcase that there is a space for you and your unique self actually fits into the space that is AT&T, right? And it's actually proven to be very successful as of right now. We're doing more, at least with my particular role, I'm doing a lot more as far as webinars and conversations with various organizations like Skills for Chicagoland's Future. And not necessarily trying to tell them that we have jobs that are available, but let's talk about your skills and your development training too. Let's address it to a place where you may be talking to AT&T, but you're talking and you're getting yourself prepared for any work that you want to do. You don't have limits. There's no putting you into a silo, because I think a lot of times when we're going out and we're doing a lot of these job fairs and these events, that we're of course we want to try to recruit and tell people to work for us, but we're in a place to where it's almost like every man for himself. Let's make sure that everybody is ready and prepared to go out there and get what rightfully belongs to them.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's sort of related to this other question that I had about sourcing talent and trying to be as unbiased as possible about where you find these candidates. And I'm talking specifically about AI. I mean, do you see the benefits of perhaps finding talented people through an algorithm, or are you still recruiting just old school, one human to however many people are sending in resumes? Somebody want to jump in with that one? That's okay. I mean, are you using AI?
Actually, we do use AI with AT&T, but I think that it's a delicate balance between looking at the data, understanding the data analytics, versus still putting a warm body to face. Because I think that when we look at the data on paper, it doesn't really give us the story that we need in order for us to really diversify our workforce. And that's something that we have to be super mindful of as you're looking at the data, especially recruiting in this particular space, post George Floyd, because you can sit back and you can see the perfect candidate, but if that doesn't align with the actual vision, the culture, and the place, from what you see as a person versus what you see in the data, that hire is not going to work out for you and what you're trying to accomplish if you're trying to be more inclusive and diversify your workforce.
Well, I'm also thinking about accountability and how that factors into attracting and retaining a diverse talent pool. Does your organization have any measures to hold staff accountable, or are there initiatives like referral bonuses, for example? I mean, I know, Leah, you said referrals are problematic at best, but I know that there are some companies, and I believe that one of them is Intel, that they do give referral bonuses to attract more diverse talent. So what are you seeing, Leah?
On the referral side specifically, we've seen companies do referral bonuses for anyone that's hired, but there are certain incentives for underrepresented groups, and given the kind of organization you are and the industry you're in, right? Because these things have high variability based on these industries. Technology is very different than a company like Walmart or AT&T, where you have lots of different people in different groups, and you would see variances in your racial and represented makeups. So you really have to think about your whole organization and make sure that the question you're asking isn't, are we diverse, but is every part of our organization getting a diverse voice, right? And that's, I think Chad used the word privilege before, and I've used this talking about remote as well, right? A lot of us live in a world of privilege right now that we can work from home. If you look at the data, about 55% of the US working population cannot work from home. It's not on the list of options for them. They have to go into a building because they move product, or because they deliver, or because they make product. There are lots of people in this world that cannot work from home. And so we have to think about each of our different groups and say, we may overall as an organization be very diverse, but actually our tech teams are not. And that's also not okay. And we need to think about, how do we start to move that? Because it's going to take time, right? And there's lots of broken rungs, as we know. Women have faced a very challenging time being promoted in that first promotion, and so have people of color and other underrepresented groups. So we need to start to think about this as a group by group organizational perspective of how do we make changes across the board, and how do we look at it through these different lenses, and not just through the, yes, referrals are a problem. I think they're a problem. I don't think they're a problem you should get rid of. I think you should re-architect how you do it so that you are incenting towards where the organization is headed.
And someone has to be accountable to it, someone or everyone. So that's I guess my larger question is who is accountable for these efforts? Who should be accountable? I mean, is it just a leadership thing, or does it start from the bottom up? Chad, do you want to take on this?
I think, and Lydia, you teed it up perfectly, building on Leah's point, is accountable for what, right? Are we accountable for, and we'd always talk about seeds and soil. So are we accountable for getting the right seeds? Or are we accountable for evolving the soil to make sure soil, AKA company DNA, systems, policy, structures, where we meet, how we meet, where we work, how we work, that has to evolve to make sure that once we get the seeds that are diverse, that they are able to grow and mature and feel comfortable and safe. So I think sometimes, including in the nonprofit sector, we get it twisted, right? We're trying to be accountable for the numbers. And it's how somebody put it in the questions, I think, what's the actual change in terms of culture and how do you quantify that? That's the tricky part. Sometimes you can't, except by a 360 loop of feedback that comes from all levels of employees to the senior leadership at multiple levels that then gets directly translated into systemic change in policies, practices, and procedures. And our CEO, Kevin Washington, and our Chief Diversity Officer, Linda, my two mentors, they got on a call with like hundreds of our local Y staff and said, hold us accountable. If we can't call it out, if we don't name it, we can't fix it. I'll tell you, I would follow them into the fire after they're hearing them say that and see them implement that. And I'm sure that would be something that other employees would be looking for across other sectors.
Someone want to add another insight to that? I mean, I think that, you know, it's got to be top down and bottom up, but that's just my opinion from what I've seen. But I'd like to know what's in practice. Yvonne, do you want to talk about the DOE?
Yeah, I'll add that our divisions, we are such a large organization. We have multiple, we have 7,000 employees across our administrative functions from HR to IT to multilingual learners, special ed, legal. And they all have set equity goals to create targeted accountability and structures to support our equity and excellence for all vision and agenda. And then each of those leaders have created in their own fashion, either equity working groups or equity committees or leveraged affinity spaces to hold themselves accountable to meeting those goals and having the diverse voices and experiences of colleagues across the system to inform the plan and the agenda. We also use, because we're civil service, we have hiring pools and we have to track around a test and exam. That's kind of how we are able to recruit for our central administrative roles. And we have underutilization data where we look at every single role and every single title within civil service and look at the trends around disproportionality around race and gender, and then reflect on our recruitment practices and our retention strategies to address those. And we do that as the human capital and in partnership with our Equal Opportunity Office. And then we also have community and advocacy groups that hold us accountable all the time around equity and diversity. There have been a set of recommendations that have been brought publicly to the DOE around school diversity measures and goals. And we have publicly spoke to those recommendations and where we were able to adopt them as is or needed to make adjustments or our work towards it, and continuously working to ensure that the public is aware of our commitment around and our accountability. We use our Chancellor, Richard Carranza. He is a self-identified equity warrior for our organization, and he uses social media a lot and Twitter. And I found that our offices and teams have been really inspired to talk about the work that they're doing that supports equity and social justice and have like a public presence. I imagine that supports our ability to recruit candidates to join our organization because they're seeing externally the great work that we're doing internally.
Monique, how about you?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would definitely say that I feel like we have, you know, the ability within the organization to make those changes, but given that I'm not physically in one of those seats, it's hard for me to be able to state exactly how that's being done. But I will say on the receiving end, I do see it. And I am very confident. And I think that, again, going back to my earlier points about transparency, that we need to let our employees know exactly how this is playing out and then empower them with the tools to be able to go out and, you know, help to multiply that effect.
All right, well, we are just at the top of the hour, so it is time to take questions from the audience. But first, Steve.
Everybody, thanks to all of you who are participating in our webinar on diversity hiring, innovative ways to have companies meet their goals, and to our sponsor, Appcast. At this point, we'll be taking questions from the audience. We've got quite a lively Q&A channel going on, and I will turn it over to Lydia to pluck out some of the best questions.
Thank you. Yeah, we definitely don't have time to answer all of these, but I see that certain ones are addressed to certain panelists. And as I always say, I'm trying to grab the broadest ones possible. If you do have a specific question for a specific panelist, please feel free to reach out through the organization's website or on LinkedIn, and we will be happy to connect with you that way. We do have one broad question here from someone who's staying anonymous. What are some strategies you've used to attract a diverse applicant pool that you've found to be successful? So we're going right back to recruiting 101. How do you attract a diverse applicant pool? Who wants to start with that one?
What I can say again is to show up where those applicants are. So is that, changing the schools that you primarily recruit from? Is that going to either vocational or industry, events, and making sure that you have a presence, a recruitment booth, or whatever that may be. And I think, again, it may be easier to do so now, and it may not be as prohibitive in terms of a cost. So there really are, fewer barriers and less excuses to do so.
And if I can build on that too, I think I agree completely with Monique's point. And sometimes we try to recruit diversity before we address our institution internally so that the diversity stays or feels safe. And so I think that's the other thing is and it was embedded in the question you asked, Lydia, is it's not an either or, it's a both and, because no company has the money to spend recruiting people so they turn over every year, right? So there's a lot of money saved if we are able to retain folks, but retention efforts oftentimes do not come with cultural competency, right? They're not informed by employee resource groups. They're not informed by the few people. Even if we have one or two, how do we engage them in asking, well, why are you staying? What can we do better? We ask people we haven't hired yet to tell us how the company that they haven't worked for can do better, instead of asking the people that are working for us. Excuse the wind.
Yes, to Chad's point, and I love that he brought up ERG groups and the importance of employee resource groups, because I think that is one of the best ways to actually put feet to the street and really utilize those diverse groups and put those into those spaces, put those individuals into those spaces in order to really show external candidates that we do speak what the language that we're speaking, we support it fully. And I've seen a lot of success with that when I actually switched my hats off from being a talent acquisition manager to switching into me being a lead officer in one of our ERGs here with AT&T. And I think that Monique can probably speak to the same thing, where that passion kind of shines through a little bit more when you're speaking to somebody that's not necessarily looking for a job with the company, but then they become intrigued because of the cause that you support. So I think that AT&T is actually doing a tremendous job with leveraging our EGs in our recruiting efforts, because they understand. I think that we do understand culturally that is really key, because we're already rallying the troops internally, and we can always take that energy outside to where people that need to see it the most can see it.
And I would also say that there's a bit more authenticity to that as well.
Building on that, Brittany, we have 7 employee resource groups, and one is our Black and Latino employee networking and development group called The Blend. And they saw a need to support diversity hiring and promotional opportunities for employees, our Black and Latino employees across the system. So they one of their first initiatives was to push the Division of Human Capital to run a career development week internally for current employees. That was inclusive of our school-based employees and teachers to come learn about what our central opportunities are. It included opportunities to discuss civil service and how that impacts your ability to move within our organization, coaching opportunities, resume review, workshops with our senior leaders to talk about what they're looking for in their candidates and about their work. That went beyond. They started to get requests from offices who were having challenges with diversity hiring. And they, as part of their newsletter, started to post internal job opportunities where offices and divisions were recruiting and looking for a diverse candidate pool. And that became something that was like much larger than they anticipated and started to really become a business resource group for the organization. And that led into them formally providing us like recommendations for us to consider as human capital, and having our senior leaders at the table to hear what are their recommendations and following up on those recommendations. That ultimately impacted our structured interviewing policy, our toolkit, our diversity recruitment toolkit, our policies around having diverse hiring panels, et cetera. So we definitely have used our employee resource groups to inform our strategy.
It may not answer the question specifically, but I do want to add that as a leader of a resource group, there is an opportunity to ensure that you are elevating the folks inside your organization. So one thing that we have seen is, as much as we want to attract and get in new talent from a diverse spectrum, how are the folks within your organization supported? How are they doing? What's their attrition numbers look like? So utilizing that resource group to be able to help demystify the promotion process, or being able to utilize them to, again, as Yvonne was saying, ensure that they have development opportunities. So even something that we're doing now is like, development seems like a secret society sometimes. Like, how did this person get in this mentor group? How did this person get this sponsor? How, what are the programs? So again, making it plain and making sure everyone has the same information.
On the recruiting side, some things that we've seen a lot of organizations starting to adopt, one, to go beyond just the traditional diversity job boards. That's a unfortunate job box checking exercise that we have seen. There are low volumes of people engaging on those sites. And so looking for candidates on a much broader level, to reaching out to normal universities, right? Universities are just because they're not a historically Black college does not mean that they don't have a variety of great candidates and opportunities. And three, taking a really hard look at your job descriptions themselves and requirements and asking, are you creating barriers to diversity unintentionally? Does this position really require a 4-year degree or a master's degree? Or are we just asking for that because we can, right? And so really making sure you're not unintentionally creating barriers to your own success in reaching a diverse audience, and you're not asking them to opt out. One of the things we know is that women and people of color particularly are more likely to try to match all of the requirements in your job description, where oftentimes white men will not. They will say, I'm close enough, and they'll still apply for your job. So if you've created the bar too high, you've actually created an opportunity for candidates to have bias against the job and take themselves out of contention without even meaning to do it. So really making sure that you are asking for things that are real as opposed to a wish list.
Yeah, and I think that that's partly an answer to this other question about in thinking of roles that do not lend themselves well to remote work, how do we activate greater equity in terms of opportunity and privilege, or create balance so that equity can be achieved? And Leah, I think you said it really well, that sometimes the job description, because it's a boilerplate and just gets passed from one generation to the next, people are coming out of contention just because it sounds like not something that they would feel like they would belong. Chad, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so an example from one of our local Ys, and I might get which Y wrong, but we are having to furlough and lay off a lot of folks as our membership numbers go down. I think it's Seattle, Loria Yeadon, the CEO of the Seattle Y, they took a larger furlough, part-time furlough at the senior level, but ensured that at the front line, the people who could not work remotely, but who are showing up every day, were still able to maintain all of their hours. That sent a huge message, right? Another one, Houston, Steve Ives is the CEO there, the YMCA there. All of them, himself included, took rolling furloughs. So when the leadership demonstrates that they're all in on this, and even at YUSA, our senior leadership took a 25% pay cut off the top. At lower levels, the peons like me, we took a 10%. But that spoke volumes about the commitment that existed around ensuring that those that were on the front lines, that's a step toward equity. If that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. Does anyone want to add to that? We'll go on to the next. We have multiple people asking the same or similar questions. We have Linda and Margaret both asking about buy-in, suggestions for engaging senior leadership and mid-level managers, and what approach did you take to enlist buy-in at the highest and mid-levels? What common roadblocks to overcome?
I would say that that's always a challenge. I'm looking at everyone's faces in organizations. For our employee resource groups, we have senior leadership sponsors, and those sponsors are at our cabinet level. And we feel that's important to show our commitment to these groups, how they are integral to our diversity and inclusion efforts, and to frankly provide access to members of our ERGs to senior leadership. That when we've done needs assessments and employee engagement surveys, one of the important things that folks want is access to senior leadership. And so we use those sponsors to support the ERGs to bring in other leaders to support their events and activities, but also to listen around recommendations and challenges that they may have and how we can make adjustments.
And then speaking in the nonprofit lens, boards, right? Boards of directors play a critical role in making sure that there's buy-in. Because when the board tells a CEO, this is what you're going to do, it's what you do. And I would assume something like that is the same in for-profit institutions. But also representational diversity matters. Our incoming chair at YUSA's national board is a Latina, the first woman of color who will ever be in that role. There has been a huge amount of impact that she's been able to drive around accountability. Cici Rojas is her name because of the lens that she brings. So when we talk about diverse recruitment, it's not just so our picture, I know I'm minimizing this, not just so our pictures look pretty, right? But it's so that there's different perspectives that can help enhance and affirm what you just asked today, that buy-in isn't optional. That it's not tied to the nice thing, a cool thing, but tied to a business case or a risk management lens or reputation protection, or we don't want to get sued lens, so that it lives and endures forever.
Am I still there? I'll add that we also embedded our diversity inclusion training and our implicit bias efforts into all of our leadership and management programs, so that we wanted to build that into the fabric of what we define as a leader and a successful manager within our organization. So buy-in certainly at the top, but as we're growing our own, how can we ensure that they support and understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Again, a couple more similar questions. So we have Lynn asking about having a more difficult time finding diverse candidates in rural areas and asking for advice. And then Celia saying, I didn't hear specific platforms, just a broad answer, going to schools. Do you have specific sites?
I can speak to my own experience. I moved from New York City to rural Northwest Arkansas. So it may take, having to kind of bring folks from other places.
Does anyone have any recommendations about specific sites to recruit from? The other point that another attendee is asking is that HBCUs are great, but you're attracting a junior level candidate. So what about mid and executive level roles? Where can you find those people that are more diverse but suited to those roles?
I think the same thing applies, Lydia. And I'm just jumping right in, so I'm so sorry. But I think the same rule actually applies with looking at your HBCUs and resourcing those alumni channels in order to get that talent from those places. Also looking in a lot of the leadership development programs that are really catered towards bringing in diverse talent pipelines. I know that there are many organizations that I do work with that have a singular focus in on those mid-level and executive level recruitment efforts. So, and most of that is going into those alumni channels, not just even just focusing on HBCUs, but also looking at Black alumni channels and predominantly white universities. For instance, I actually reaped the benefits of that because I went to a PWI and really was engaged and involved in my alumni channel to where I could actually see positions that were opening up and really get that networking going and establishing those relationships in that way. So I definitely recommend anybody that's looking to recruit and hire in that space to really dive into not just the first layer of what we do with our internships and that fresh college graduate opportunity that we usually tap into. But I think that those alumni spaces are a great tool to use in order to get a lot of that talent outsourced.
To build on Brittany's point, I'll say, so two that we've partnered with when I talked about the North Carolina A&T commitment that we made is the Executive Leadership Council. So this is a management council made up of high-ranking African Americans across industry. So that is one location where you can turn to, and they have no lack of diverse candidates to put in front of people, especially those who are very senior. And then Management Leadership for Tomorrow. It's a program that specifically prepares people for MBA programs, and they encompass Black, Latinx, Native backgrounds to ensure, again, the opportunities are put in front of that pool.
If I can add to that, I mean, I think there's another opportunity that we're still working on in transparency, and that's chambers of commerce, right? Local and national chambers of commerce can be a huge value add to getting diverse candidates of specific dimensions of diversity and or allies and or even engaging in trainings for other staff. Someone put in the comments, how are white men feeling? Something like that. That's an important question. And we really want to make sure that when we talk about diverse recruitment, diversity is everyone, right? And a lot of times right now, when we hone in on the word diversity being synonymous with only specific dimensions, which is what I hear some of us leaning towards, that can be problematic when inclusion needs to extend to everyone. And our country is more polarized now than ever. So we're talking about diversity recruitment and hiring that has to extend in all directions, but we have to also recognize the cultural competency and the systemic differences and privilege that some of us have, that some of us don't have when we engage in that conversation. And I ask your grace, sorry that I brought that. I just thought it was a really important point, but some of my colleagues may disagree.
We have also a couple of attendees that are asking just about the super basics. For example, Lynn is saying, I stepped forward in my organization and state government to say we need to address diversity and inclusion, but I don't know where to start. And someone else is asking about taking the first steps as well, especially when the organization is very homogenous. So can we do a quick recap of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion 101 for these fine folks?
I would say start with the data. So do an audit internally of, fleshing out like where you all stand, and if parity is your goal, like put something to paper in terms of what you think would be exemplary for where you are. So don't just look at what everybody else is doing and say we need to get there. How can you actively affect change with where you currently are?
And also, sorry, go ahead, Leah.
I was going to say, I agree. And one of the ways to do the data piece is not to just look at the entire organization, which most people can look left and right, but say, all right, what have we done in the last 12 months? So we can understand what our current active hiring practices look like. And along with putting pen to paper where we're headed and trying to support the voices inside our organization, whatever they might be, who are allies or who are people of color. Or in my organization, I work in technology, so there are more men than women. So the women actually are part of the smaller group of people in our organization. Right? What is it that they're saying are some of our immediate problems that we can address? How can we make that first step forward? Because you can't take a leap if you haven't taken that step first.
And building off Leah's comment of the first step, creating a space for conversation sometimes is where we start. Data is critical. And sometimes, though, people just need a space to be, to talk, to disagree, to ask questions, to debate professionally, respectfully. And that is a part of diversity and inclusion and equity work. That's where I would recommend to start and ask the question of why. Why are we doing this? And if it's just because someone told us to, or because it's in our strategic plan and that's it, then ask the question of, is that enough? And dig deep. Again, individual, organizational in that context would be my humble guidance.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would add, if you don't have internal expertise, then think about leveraging external partners, DEI practitioners to help you with the audit, to help you to set a mission, revisit maybe your mission or priorities, thinking about individual coaching at the leadership level to have your own equity statement of why this is important to you and why you're committed to this work moving forward. Having a training and development plan that is inclusive of building the capacity of your teams to do this work and continue it, because you can't just farm it out. You have to build expertise internally. And then I would say review your web presence, your marketing materials, the resources you create. Are they biased in any way? Are they more homogenous? And how can you ensure that wherever you're putting your footprint, that people of diverse backgrounds feel that they would would see themselves within the organization.
One of the things that we did over the summer, which was far too late, was we also looked at compensation and took a hard look at, are we paying equitably our various folks based on, of course, we have regional differences. So we were taking that into account, but making sure that your pay is equitable. It's a good place to start for a lot of organizations because it's a more comfortable place for some folks to be. But I think the other piece on the other side is there's a ton of data in the market that helps defend why this is a good idea, why having lots of voices at the table makes your organization better, how you can avoid groupthink, and how you can move the organization towards the bottom line in a positive direction. So sometimes if all else fails, the data, it's good for a business is the first thing you can do to get folks to move along.
Well, that's a lot of good information. I hope you all were taking notes on that. I know that we mentioned a couple of times about allies, and I would really like to talk about in these last few minutes that we have about recognizing and rewarding inclusive behavior like allyship and what effect that has on recruiting and retention. So this is a question for all of you. We can do the round robin. Monique, let's start with you.
Oh, allyship. I think there are lots of ways to define that. So it really depends on, where you're at again in your journey, and not necessarily putting that responsibility squarely on one group, similar to what Chad has kind of alluded to previously. But I think that we have to be able to look at where our associates are at now. How do we create a track and a path and a plan? And how are they feeling marginalized? Like, I think at the onset of some of the civil unrest, there were a lot of emotions that may have felt pent up and may have felt like they came out of nowhere, but that's really not the case. They've been there, and they've been deep-seated and long-standing. And so we have to really give ourselves space and time to kind of unpack that and make sure that people are feeling supported and comforted. And then asking specifically and addressing, like, okay, what do you need? Like, don't just create these programs in a vacuum. Don't just say, I'm standing with you and create these, bumper stickers and buttons. That's not doing anybody any good. What we actually need are actual plans, actual, for your own understanding. Like, I've gone to Yad Vashem in Israel because I cared about the Holocaust, just personally. Like, I wanted to understand what that struggle looked like. I moved to Northwest Arkansas. I went to visit the Trail of Tears here because I wanted to understand the Native flag. So I think there's a lot of authenticity that needs to be sought out personally, especially if you are in a leadership position. So I tell, folks around my team all the time, like, if you are in philanthropy and you don't have a racial equity lens, that is a concern. Like, we shouldn't just be thinking about that now. So I say all that to say, like, it is deeply personal, and you need to start within your own, active learning and listening path.
Brittany?
Monique, we can be best friends in real life. I kid you not, because everything you said was really spot on. And I'm going to add this layer because allyship really boils down to, and I'm learning this more and more as I work in the disability space with my EG, because that's huge, and it's empathy. And it's looking at empathy in a lens to where we are not, as allies, we're not trying to put a victim statement out there first as if we relate. We're just sitting back, listening to really, truly understand. We're listening not to respond, but we are listening to engage and really embrace that there's change that needs to take place. And I think that and that's where I feel that true allyship really does start, because we're doing a lot of talking, but over the summer, I didn't feel like there was a lot of listening. I felt like we were doing a lot of talking. There was a lot of engagement, and we had the illusion as if, because we're filling up rooms and we're getting the message out there, that people are really listening and engaging. Again, 6 months down the line, we're still here. We haven't really moved the needle much in a way that really, really makes sense. And we're more divided than ever before. And our places of employment really serves as a safe place for a lot of us, because this is one of the few places where we don't necessarily have to talk about it, but we know that it's there. So really trying to get to a place to where we are really truly listening and emphasizing and practicing empathy in that way, to where we don't have to necessarily touch it to fix it. As allies, it's not our job to fix it. Our job is to support and engage and really, I like to say, love on other people in a way to where they feel safe. And then most importantly, they feel engaged to where they'll continue to come back and really push towards the fight.
If I can add to that, and I would love to also be your friend Monique and yours, Brittany, I think we're all vibing on here. Allyship is not passive, and it's also not something we get to decide for ourselves. I can't jump on and say, I am an ally for whatever community. The community has to give me that privilege. Individuals identify with that community get to give me that privilege. And sometimes I think we get it twisted and we walk around, like you said, Monique, buttons, right? I saw a button that said ally, and I was like, who gave you that? Because I identify with the community that is on your button, and I would not quantify you there just yet. We'll work on that together, right? Also, allyship requires risk. It's tied to privilege. Allyship means you risk something, your relationship. For me, my relationship with some of my family and friends. When I say I had a shirt that said Asians for Black Lives, I wear that and I stand up and down on the Zoom to show it intentionally. That generates some conversations sometimes because not everyone is aligned. Allyship requires risk and awareness of privilege. It's not passive, and it's not something we get to decide for ourselves. It's a humble honor that is bestowed by others.
But does it help with retention and recruiting?
Sorry, and it
I
does.
think it does.
Sorry, I
believe it
didn't, but I
absolutely
think that's really, that's the meat of it here, because I think just like with, the pledges, are they real? Are they authentic? Are the allies real? Are they authentic? Are they helping to foster a sense of belonging within the organization?
I think it does, absolutely. And because you see that people are really being transparent, they're being genuine, and again, they're unpacking their authentic self. An ally of mine once told me, I remember having my face absolutely broken one day because I have big, beautiful, natural hair. And I had a Black colleague tell me that it wasn't acceptable for me to wear my fro to work. And I was devastated because I'm like, okay, how can someone that looks like me, that I aspire to be, tell me something like that? It was a white ally that told me, that listened to my plight. She didn't try to take over it. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't try to go to that person and say, okay, this is wrong, and be my superhero of the day. But she really gave me some things that reassured me as an employee in my career development that allowed me to embrace my true authentic self, such where now I can get on a webinar call and have burgundy hair and really engage. And that doesn't take away from the information and the tools that I'm sharing with you today. Thank you. But it doesn't take away from anything that I'm sharing with you as far as career development and even recruitment and hiring practices. But that proves the point of, if you are a true ally, it shows. You don't have to sit back and wave the flag that you're there. You don't have to sit back and wear the t-shirt and have the button to acknowledge that you are who you are. You are who you are by being your authentic self. And that's what it really boils down to. And people see right through you. People see that. And when people can see that, employees can see that, they can buy into that. And in turn, the candidates that we are looking for to build these pipelines can also feel that and see that too. And they'll come on.
Anyone have any final thoughts? We're in the final minute here. So awesome. Well, this has been, as always, a stimulating and very important discussion. So I thank you, Leah, Monique, Yvonne, Brittany, and Chad for being with me. Thank the audience for being so engaged and spending an hour and a half with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia, and to our expert speakers. That was a great conversation and an important one. We're honored to have you here today. Thank you again to Appcast and to all of you for participating in the audience. You are a really engaged audience, judging from the dozens of comments and questions. That was great. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. On Wednesday, December 2nd, after the holiday, inclusive performance management, why empathy is a key ingredient. On Thursday, December 3rd, HR and the CEO, the most critical relationship for success in 2021. On Thursday, December 10th, how technology is changing employee experience. And on Tuesday, December 15th, we'll be doing our 5th full-scale virtual conference with panel discussions and workshops. And we'll be coming back to today's topic in a major way with a focus on inclusive leadership in 2021, creating diversity, accountability, and real equity. Visit our website at fromdayone.co to learn more. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Thanksgiving holiday, even if we're all homebound. Stay well.